at it to finish off this lecture. We had been talking about, this is just a reminder to get back in our frame of mind for the objectives for the lecture. We've gone through objectives 1, 2, and 3. Well, we're sort of partway through 3, summarizing the young Earth creationist perspective, discussing some predictions that it makes. And then we'll move on to discuss sort of strengths and weaknesses of the young Earth approach, and we'll critique it from both scientific and theological perspectives. And just to remind you that we are going to have this same approach for all the models that we talk about. So all the different models of integration between biology and Christian faith, we're going to give them the same treatment across the board. Okay, so we had the last example that we had where we finished last time, just to get our minds back where we were discussing this one specific prediction of the fossil geologic column, the fossil record, and how young Earth creationism as a model predicts that fossils should be in essentially a random order. The hypothesis being if the vast majority of the fossil record is laid down catastrophically in about 1 year during Noah's flood, then essentially stuff is going to be mixed up and you're going to find sort of a cross-section of all life that was present at that time essentially randomly distributed in the fossil record. Now, there's lots of potential examples that we could use to show that this specific prediction is not borne out in the fossil record. The one that we're specifically looking at is this idea of pollen. The reason for choosing pollen is because it is so widespread today. It fossilizes so extremely well. It's very resilient and fossilizes. It's also quite easily dispersed from its point of origin because it's wind-borne. So you can find pollen in almost any terrestrial environment today, even if there are not flowering plants nearby. Okay, so it's very well distributed. We also have this issue that pollen is quite easily embedded in amber. Does everybody know what amber is? So basically hardened tree resin. So we can actually look for microfossils within amber, and pollen is a good example of a microfossil that you can find within amber. And this allows us, so essentially the data is when you look for the distribution of pollen in the geologic column in the fossil record, you see that it's restricted to the upper levels, sort of from late Jurassic, early Cretaceous on. This is also where you find the remains of flowering plants. But try as you might, you look deeper into the fossil column, you will not find pollen, despite many years of concerted looking, even on the behalf of, or even on the part of young Earth creationists. We have yet to find pollen any older or any deeper than that. So, and the other reason for choosing pollen is that some models are presented within young Earth creationism that hypothesize some sort of hydrological sorting during the flood. So you see this layering of different types based on different buoyancies, different densities, that type of thing. Pollen makes a nice example to choose because we have pollen that's embedded in amber, which will sink during the flood, whereas we have different types of pollen that have different densities, such that in terms of a hydrological sorting mechanism, you would expect to find pollen, certainly pollen in amber, all throughout the column, yet it's restricted to the top layers. So that's the reason for choosing that as an example. This article from Duff, which is posted for you to look at, is well worth the read. Any questions or comments on that, just in terms of mechanics? Like I said, pollen is just one example. If you look at mammals, for example, where are mammals represented in the column? They would actually have somewhat of a similar distribution to flowering plants. You don't find mammals deep in the Cambrian or in the Devonian, that type of thing. We see a restriction of those types to the upper levels as well. Okay, so I've already told you that the young Earth creationist community rejects standard geology. This is the main reason for why they do so. So it's not surprising that their response is, well, the standard geology doesn't work. There's other models that you can hypothesize that might account for the pattern that we see in the fossil record. So I discussed briefly Dr. Kurt Wise as a young Earth creationist paleontologist. last class, Dr. Wise has developed some models, what he calls sort of ecological zonation. Perhaps at the time of the flood, different groups of animals were clustered into different geographic regions, and what we're seeing in the fossil record is the sequential demise and overturning of those different zones during the inundation of the flood. And you can see the quote here. It says, all of these mechanisms do away with the notion that the horizons of fossils demand successive passages of time during which the organisms live. Now, there are obviously some challenging issues with that type of model. We don't see that kind of ecological zonation today. We don't see flowering plants all restricted to one spot. Flowering plants are all over the place. We don't see mammals restricted all to one spot. They're dispersed into different areas and present in different ecological communities. But again, for the reason of choosing pollen as an example, we certainly don't expect to see pollen restricted like that because it's so easily dispersed by wind. So even if there was sequestering into these ecological zonations or communities, we wouldn't expect to see pollen, which is easily dispersed, restricted to those areas. Okay, another main hypothesis that young Earth creationism puts forward is that various animal kinds were independently created on Creation Week and thus do not share common ancestry with other forms of life. We've already discussed this somewhat when we were talking about evolution proper and the predictions that evolutionary theory makes in terms of DNA sequence similarities, that type of thing. The test for this is the same as what we've looked at before, in that you sequence and compare DNAs from various organisms and ask how similar they are to each other. Does it fit the pattern that you would predict by common descent? Does it fit the pattern that you might predict from independent creation without relationship by common descent? The general result here is that DNA sequencing strongly supports the evolutionary model or evolutionary theory, and it's held true for everything that we've looked at so far. That's not to say as we go on and sequence more and more things that we might not find at some point some fundamental discontinuity between groups of life. But so far, to date, we haven't. Okay. The other young Earth creationist that I mentioned last class is Dr. Todd Wood. This is from one of his papers that's also on my courses for you to look at. So this is Wood 2006. Where and the title of the paper is The Chimpanzee Genome and the Problem of Biological Similarity. He's essentially wrestling with the chimpanzee genome data from a young Earth perspective to see how well he can fit that data within his young Earth model. Some quotes that we can pull out here. What really distinguishes this paper from other young Earth creationist papers is that it very frankly deals with the data as a non-young Earth scientist would see it. He's very upfront and frank about the data, and he's actually received some flack for that within the young Earth creationist community as a result. So he's trained in this area. He has the expertise required to do this sort of analysis. And he comes up with this statement during the paper. He's saying, we're seeing the pattern between chimpanzees and humans. We're seeing the exact pattern that you would predict based on common descent. He doesn't accept common descent. He's going to go on to try to work with that. But at least he's saying, yes, we see the pattern that you would predict based on common descent. He also goes on to critique other young Earth creationists to say the response that says, well, God created it that way. That is a response, but he argues that's just an ad hoc response. It doesn't give any insight into the underlying reason, even from a young Earth creationist perspective, why what God would have created it that way. So he's really trying to struggle with this from a young Earth perspective and advance young Earth creationism as a field by honestly dealing with this issue. He also says, I've found most popular arguments about the human-chimpanzee genome similarity insufficient. I find myself in the unenviable position of devising my own explanation. Since I have none, I will attempt instead to develop some principles that could guide research into this problem. So he's basically saying, yeah, the data right now is problematic from a young Earth perspective.